gracias a todos por escaparos a esta sección del Festival Leñe, este Leñe Fantástico que ya llevamos haciendo unos años y que además a lo largo de los meses se ha ido también desestacionalizando, y esto es importante porque hace poco en Málaga, bueno, hace unos meses se habló o hicimos un acercamiento en esto de Leñe Fantástico alrededor de la figura del héroe. Entonces, el paso lógico, la continuidad, la decidimos hacer aquí hablando de la figura del superhéroe. Los superhéroes son la última mitología moderna que hemos tenido como seres humanos, y todas las mitologías en realidad, aunque hablen de personajes muy poderosos, nos hablan de nosotros mismos. Como uno escoge a sus héroes, también dice cómo es como sociedad. Esto pasa en todo en general y en el género en particular. En el terror es muy obvio, o sea, en los años 70, cuando la gente tenía miedo, en los 60, de la radiación, pues ¿cómo eran las películas de terror? Personas que pasaban una nube radiactiva y se empezaban a hacer pequeñitos, una tarántula que estallaba una bomba nuclear y se volvía gigante. Superamos eso, nuestros miedos cambiaron y las películas de terror cambiaron. Los héroes que escogemos también pasa lo mismo, se tienen que enfrentar a muchos de nuestros temores, tienen que enfrentarse o dar respuesta a cómo queremos ser como sociedad, cómo son nuestros ideales, cómo comportarnos si tuviéramos esos poderes. Y pocas personas se nos ocurrían mejor, pocas personas hay realmente mejores que Stephen Englehart para poder contarnos todo lo que queremos saber sobre este tema. Primero, porque tiene una perspectiva del tiempo, de haber ido trabajando con la figura del superhéroe a lo largo de muchos años, en momentos muy diferentes, porque también lo ha hecho en medios muy diferentes, ha hecho animación, ha hecho videojuego, ha escrito novelas y sobre todo ha hecho cómic. ¿Y por qué el cómic? Aparte porque es un medio narrativo que adoramos los que hacemos cine fantástico, porque el superhéroe ahora es cierto que está muy popularizado por el cine y demás, pero el campo realmente nativo, el lugar donde ha tenido sus mayores cotas, yo creo que es verdaderamente su terreno de juego natural, sí que me parece que es el cómic, en especial cuando hablamos de cómic norteamericano. Y a la hora de tener un creador, cuando alguien se dice, sobre todo los periódicos, ¿no?, cuando generalmente oyen campanas, pero tampoco saben mucho, dicen, ha venido el creador de tal personaje, se refieren a alguien que ha trabajado con ese personaje. Y Stephen Englehart no solo ha hecho algunas en las épocas y de las etapas más gloriosas y de las historias más importantes de muchos de los personajes que ya forman parte de la cultura popular universal, sino que él realmente sí que ha creado a muchos de esos personajes. Antes Kenny nos hablaba de Shang-Chi, los que hemos ido al cine y hemos visto por los Guardianes de la Galaxia, pues sabemos que personajes como Mantis o como Star-Lord también los ha creado él. Y tantas anécdotas que nos va a comentar ahora. Y yo creo que esta charla, aparte de hablar de su trabajo, que por supuesto lo vamos a hacer, vamos también a aprovechar su conocimiento para intentar analizar cómo ha ido evolucionando el superhéroe estos últimos años. La primera pregunta, tan fácil y tan difícil al mismo tiempo, y puede ser pie a muchos debates, sin duda, y antes de empezar a hablar de su trabajo propiamente dicho, tras tantos años, Steve, trabajando, ya antes como fan leyendo la figura del superhéroe, ¿has llegado al entendimiento de poder decirnos qué es un superhéroe?
So the question is, after all discovery, dealing with superheroes in so many mediums and creators of the superheroes from scratch, did you have now the grasp of knowledge to tell the audience what exactly is a superhero?
Oh, okay.
Just to start.
Para comenzar.
Sí.
Pues quiero decir que cuando estoy en un país donde se habla español, por unos días puedo hablar español un poquito, pero llegué ayer. Entonces voy a hablar inglés probablemente. Well, superheroes are the archetypes of the era that they're in. When the Marvel comics started, it was a very optimistic time. It was there was a lot of new frontiers. The youth was kind of coming into place, and I think Marvel in the 60s. The 60s was a time of costumes. People wore bell-bottom pants and they wore strange shirts and so forth. It was a time when people in general were sort of dressing up. And so the idea of a superhero on that optimism made sense. Since then, things in many ways have become less optimistic, and so the heroes have become more streetwise, more, you know, down to earth, and I think quite often more brutal, more, you know, more intense. That's a big answer. Can you do that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's going to be in English, so
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
just keep going.
Okay. So, I mean, the example that comes to mind for me is I was brought over to DC Comics to do Batman, and what I wanted, I like characters. I'm interested in the people, not the powers so much. I like comics, I like superhero comics, but I want to know who the person using the ring or the person in the costume or whatever is. And so when I did Batman, there were a number of things I wanted to accomplish, but one of them was to see more about Bruce Wayne. Since then, a lot of Batman stuff has become much more, he's the strongest guy in town and he will beat you up, and that's kind of the end of it. I mean, there's less of an interest in the person. It's not true for everybody, it's not true across the board, but just as a general rule, the trend of superheroes has gone toward the spectacular things they can do, and I think a lot of that comes from the movies, right? When it was just comics, the good thing about comics is you can create your whole world yourself. You're not dependent on 5,000 people doing their little bits in order to make the thing come together on the screen. And so it was more a personal expression of whatever I thought the character was. And I mean, I've done many different characters, and I hope each one of them is different from every other one that I've done. But that, if you're talking about the evolution of superheroes, I think that's, you know, where it has gone, that it's become less optimistic and more dealing with the problems of the day. One can hope that optimism will come back at some point, and it varies by country and it varies by age and all the rest of that. But I think in general, at least, well, not going to get into politics.
Sí.
But yes, I expect that things will change again over time, but that's where we are now, I think.
Entraremos más adelante en la charla seguro en política, porque ha habido cómics tuyos que han tocado muy bien el tema, pero vamos a recordar que cuando Steve empezó a trabajar en Marvel era un momento en el que se estaban poniendo las bases de muchas cosas que vinieron después. A lo largo de los años, de muchos de estos iconos se han escrito páginas y páginas y páginas, han corrido ríos de tinta, como se suele decir, y algunas historias pues, han sido fácilmente olvidables y otras han ido permaneciendo y han quedado, digámoslo así, como en el canon esencial o el ADN del personaje, ¿no? ¿Algún instinto especial tiene Steve? Que casi todas las historias que él ha escrito, casi todos los tratamientos que ha hecho de personajes han sido parte de lo que ha prevalecido de estos. Así que vamos a aprovechar para hablar con él de algunos de estos personajes. Para mí, una de las etapas del Capitán América, personaje conocido por todos, más relevantes o más interesantes, es la que ha guionizado Steve. Y lo primero que le quería preguntar es, ya que hablábamos antes de cómo afecta a la sociedad y el momento en el que vives a los personajes, cuando te encargaron hacer el Capitán América, era un personaje que Stan Lee no le tenía especial cariño. Lo empezaste a escribir en un momento, además, en el que era cuando había la mayor descreimiento en Estados Unidos, quizás sobre los políticos, el mayor movimiento antimilitar, y tú eres objetor de conciencia. Entonces, cuando te dicen, vas a hacer tú el Capitán América, ¿cómo decidiste orientarlo y cómo encajó con tus intereses personales?
Well, yes, it is true that I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, but I want to write every character as the character is. So I never, overlaid my particular political beliefs or any other beliefs on a character. I wanted to do the character that was there. And with Captain America, I had no problem doing, let me back up 1 second. When I started doing comics, my editor, Roy Thomas, said there are 2 rules. You have to turn it in on time every month, and it has to sell. And if that happens, we don't care what you do. If people are buying it and it's coming out on time, we're good with that. So I was doing Captain America, and the first thing I did, Captain America was a failing book. It was not going anywhere because they were billing him as the living legend of World War II. And nobody cared about World War II. And nobody wanted to be reminded of war in the midst of the Vietnam era. So I went home that night and I thought, well, what sort of transcends that? And what I came up with was the American ideal, the idea that it's a democracy and everybody, all the stuff that they teach you in school in America. So I reformulated Captain America as somebody who stands for that ideal rather than any particular thing that's happening in America at the time. Then a year later, Richard Nixon, the president, got caught doing illegal stuff, and there were hearings, and there was all this thing. And Watergate, as a political scandal, dominated America. This was in an era when there were only 3 television channels, and they all were covering the hearings and so forth. And it didn't make sense to me that Captain America, within his reality, would not be affected by that. That, like, he's the guy who's supposed to be involved in that. And so I did a storyline which was a simplified version of what had gone on with Nixon. And at the end of it, the unnamed head of the secret empire who had access to the presidential office blew his brains out, having failed in his attempt to get away with his crimes. And people said, oh, was there a lot of political feedback on that? No, because it was very much in tune with the times. And I thought at the age of 25, maybe, I thought, well, that's an amazing chapter in the history of America, and we won't be doing that again. I'm now old enough to see us doing that and worse, Like I said, not going to talk politics. And again, the tide seems to be turning on that, but it's, to me, well, does that answer your question?
Yeah, of course, yeah, it does.
I mean, America certainly does not live up to the ideals that it likes to talk about. And yet there is a sense in America that people would like it that way, would like it to do that. And when they have a chance to express themselves, that's generally the direction that they go. So I think that's why Captain America, this reformulated version of Captain America, standing for something larger than himself, has stuck around. And I will say again, when I and other people were doing comics in the 70s, we were doing comics in the 70s. We were doing them for you guys, month by month. You know, the idea that there would be movies, the idea that 50 years later, stuff would still be in print, never occurred. You know, that just wasn't anything that anybody thought about. I think other than Stan Lee, who decided he was going to go to Hollywood and see if he could make movies happen. But I mean, the only movies they were making in the 70s were very bad. You know, there was two really bad Captain America movies. There was a medium Doctor Strange movie. But by and large, you know, we weren't thinking about the long term on this stuff at all. It was just turn it in every month and make it entertaining. That was the idea. And yet, and yet to those of us doing it, it was important. It was something to, you know, to put your creativity into and take pride in. Yeah.
Una cosa muy brillante de tu etapa, un aspecto muy singular, es sobre todo cuando estás leyendo de joven, ¿no?, la serie del personaje que te gusta, o los personajes que te gustan, y llega un momento en el que no te das cuenta, ¿no? Lees un poco la trama, luego vuelves años después y te das cuenta de lo que ese autor pues te quería contar, o a lo mejor el juego de malabares que hizo para hablarte de otra cosa, ¿no? Estamos hablando de qué define un superhéroe. Muchas veces al superhéroe lo define incluso por ausencia. ¿Cómo reaccionamos si falta? O sea, ¿cómo rellenamos su hueco? Aunque no exista el superhéroe, la figura del superhéroe prevalece, es necesaria para nosotros. Y yo la primera vez que leí una colección de un superhéroe sin su protagonista fue cuando decidiste que en la serie del Capitán América Steve Rogers se cansaba de ser el Capitán América, y ahora va a seguir la serie, pero no va a salir el Capitán América. Y me parece que luego esto se ha hecho muchas veces, por aquel entonces no estaba tan visto, y me parece muy interesante hablarnos de la figura del superhéroe quitando al superhéroe.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and how did you came with this concept that has been used plenty of times since you come with it, and how it links with the story that you are telling about Captain America and the siblings that you were talking before in the last question?
Yeah, well, again, I saw Captain America as somebody who believed in the American ideals. And in those stories, I never said it was the president who killed himself in the presidential office, but, you know, everybody understood that. Nixon himself did not kill himself, so I could not kill Nixon in the comic. But it seemed to me, I mean, the origin of Captain America from the 40s was that he was a skinny guy who really wanted to get involved in that war effort. That was a popular war in the 40s. And took the super serum so that he could do that and so forth. He was someone who believed in the American ideals. And to see the president kill himself in the presidential office, having failed trying to commit crimes, really shook that character to his core, I thought. And therefore, I did this sequence where I did Captain America comics with no Captain America in them. He quit. He could not put on that costume and be Captain America, so he became the nomad, the man without a country. And he still wanted to do heroic things, but he didn't want to do them as Captain America. Now, I'm not stupid, so I understood that at some point Captain America would have to come back to Captain America comics. But I wanted to see how long I could stretch that out. How long can I do this story without Captain America in the Captain America book and still sell the book, make people interested in the book. So I was exploring the character again, and I have found in my writing, I don't know things until they happen. I mean, I can say, this is where I'm gonna go with it, but when I'm actually doing it, somebody says something, and then somebody else reacts to that, and then somebody else reacts to that, and it's all the characters working with each other. And so I just followed that character, the character that I had in my head about who Steve Rogers was. Where would he go? And the eventual ending was, because he wasn't Captain America, other people were trying to take over, trying to be Captain America, and they were all coming to bad ends. It wasn't working out because they weren't as good as he was at doing that. And so in the end, he felt he had to come back. That was my explanation for why he came back. But again, we could do things like that, and it just didn't make any sense to me to do anything else, I guess, is what I'm saying. If Captain America had just sort of fought supervillains all the way through the Watergate thing without paying any attention, it didn't. The Marvel universe was supposed to be the same universe we're all living in. And so it's sort of what I had to do because of what I'd set that character up to be. And it was, interesting to explore.
Vamos a pasar a los Vengadores, otros personajes conocidos por todo el mundo, en los que hiciste un montón de etapas exitosas, pero tu llegada a la serie es distinta a tu llegada al Capitán América. Bueno, o sea, te lo encarga Roy Thomas igual, pero el Capitán América era una serie que no estaba vendiendo nada, pero los Vengadores era una serie que estaba funcionando muy bien, que además la había guionizado el que ahora te daba el encargo y que en realidad solo la habían escrito prácticamente otras dos personas. Siendo un chico joven, lleno de ilusión, con los personajes que le gustan, ¿se siente distinta la presión a la hora de que te den un título que dices, bueno, si la cago total ya no estaba vendiendo, a uno que sea un éxito y que sabes que las expectativas van a ser mucho más altas?
Right. Yeah, the Avengers was being written by the editor, Roy Thomas, and I thought that Roy Thomas's Avengers was really good comics. As a reader, I really liked what he was doing in that book. And for whatever reason, he decided when he couldn't do it anymore, he was going to hand it to me. And this, again, is possibly interesting from a writing standpoint in that what I tried to do for the first 6 months was Roy Thomas stories. In my head, I would hear what Roy would have done with these things, and I tried to do that, and I wasn't satisfied. I didn't think it was coming off. And eventually, it occurred to me that what I ought to be doing was Steve Englehart stories. And I went from there. But there definitely was pressure, The Avengers was one of the top books. And if, in the end, I figured out that what I needed to do to make it work was to go in this particular direction. But there was definitely a sense of like, I've got to do what he did at first. But I talk about how things happen in the story that changes the story. When I first introduced Mantis in that first era, she was a prostitute from Saigon who was going to get into the Avengers because her boyfriend had joined the Avengers. And I wanted her to seduce all of the male members of the Avengers to cause dissension and problems in the ranks. And the very next month, Marvel had done giant-size annuals every summer. And, and I, as a reader, I had really liked those. And then Marvel decided they weren't going to do that this particular summer. And I thought, well, then what can I do that will be like a big ticket thing, something big to do for the summer? And I came up with this idea of the Avengers, who I was writing, and the Defenders, who I was writing, having a conflict all summer long. And the books came out 2 weeks apart, so it was like 8 episodes of a story coming out twice a month, in a sense. I've been told since then this is like the first bi-monthly comic, although it was actually 2 comics crisscrossing. So each Avenger had to fight each Defender, little wars of what they were. And that meant Mantis had to be an Avenger. She couldn't be seducing people in the middle of this conflict. And so she became a totally different character at that point. I mean, later on I played with her seducing the Vision if she could, but I mean, she became a teammate. She became a solid part of the Avengers at that point. And so everything that I'd envisioned about what I was going to do with her just went out the window at that point. And she kind of showed me who she was after that. The same thing again of she did this, and so that meant that other people reacted to her in a certain way, and then she reacted to that. She was the one really who taught me the idea that you let your characters tell you who they are. You know, I can say I want her to go to Sevilla, and instead she goes to Aviles. So it's like, okay, but maybe I still can get the storyline that I want, but I have to, you know, they're different places. There's different ways to do that. And that's fun for me as a writer. I mean, that's what I'm doing month by month while I'm writing these things. If it was just filling in the blanks, it would be very boring to sit there and do that. Because in the end, I'm sitting by myself in a room, and if I'm not entertaining myself, I certainly am not entertaining you. Years later, in like the early 2000s, I was asked to do a series for Marvel, and the process at that time was, tell me what you're going to do for the first 12 issues. And that's about the time that I said, I can't work in this environment, because not only do I not know what I'm going to do in the first 12 issues, but if I did, and a year from now, I was just checking off boxes, you know, I'm doing this and I'm doing, because a year ago I said I was going to do that. It didn't interest me. So to go back to the Avengers, it's just, every one of them was their own character, and in the end, all anybody can do is just try to do the best they can. I mean, I understand that when I stop writing the Avengers, somebody else is going to take it over, right? And they should do the best they can, and so on and so forth. I just wanted somehow or other to maintain the quality that I thought was already there. But it was interesting to me as a young writer to figure out that the way you did that was not to replicate what was already there. It was to find another way to kind of be as interesting. And that comes from me. We were talking about AI earlier. Yeah. And, you know, I personally am not convinced that AI will ever be able to match an actual human being's storytelling, because of the fact that you're in the moment, you're deciding things as you go. And AI, you know, has been programmed to do this, that, and the other thing, and it will do it, but it can't say, oh, but this other thing, you know. It's the human element, I think, that will always, I mean, we were saying, there'll be classic stuff done by AI, because in any era, people use whatever technology they've got, you know, the same way some people wrote classic operas, wrote classic silent movies, wrote classic, you know, whatever. Somebody will write classic stuff simply by plugging in AI to do it. But will it be as classic as stuff done by actual human beings? And I'm not convinced that it will.
La relación, sí. La relación de personaje de Mantis y autor, en este caso Steve, es de las más singulares. No solo porque hayan pasado mucho tiempo juntos, sino porque han pasado mucho tiempo juntos por un montón de colecciones diferentes y, en cierta manera, y haciendo un poco de trampa, incluso por editoriales diferentes, ¿no? Él cambiaba de colección, cambiaba de universo y su versión de Mantis le acompañaba y, además, como continuaba digamos, la carrera vital que había iniciado en el universo anterior. Y cuando volvía al universo, si ninguno había tenido un hijo, el personaje que reaparecía en Marvel, pues también tenía un hijo, ¿no? Y lo fuiste llevando a los Cuatro Fantásticos, lo fuiste llevando a Estela Plateada en tu regreso a Marvel, siempre ha estado ahí. E incluso generó un vacío, porque cuando después de un origen de 19 episodios, que debe ser el origen más largo jamás contado de un personaje en la historia de los superhéroes, se marchó de la colección convertida en Madonna Celestial, tuviste que reconstruir y hacer unos nuevos Vengadores con los que encontrarte cómodo. Así que cuando vas al cine, ves Los Guardianes de la Galaxia, no sé si habías estado muy pendiente cómo ha ido evolucionando el personaje, y ves la nueva versión de Mantis, ¿cómo fue tu reacción? ¿Lo amaste? ¿Lo odiaste? ¿Te dio igual? Cuéntanos un poquito cómo fue ver... Porque bueno, al final en Marvel tienes una caja de juguetes que no son tuyos, te dejan jugar con ellos un rato y luego los tienes que volver a meter en la caja y otro va a jugar con esos juguetes, ¿no? Cuéntanos cómo fue ver a otro jugar con tu juguete.
Other people writing about Mantis, how it felt terrible, felt great, interesting.
Well, there's another writer named Kurt Busiek that some people might know. We had a talk about that one time, and we find it, him, difficult to read later versions of characters that we did, because you're continually saying, that's not exactly how I, and again, I think people should do what they do. The later versions of these characters should be those people's expressions of it. But it's difficult to follow, for me at least, because I've been so invested in this is how I worked her out in this case. I mean, the biggest thing with Mantis, of course, is the movie. The Mantis in the movies, the only thing that Mantis and my Mantis have in common is that they're both female. That's it. They're different colors, they have different speech patterns, they have different looks, they have all that stuff. And, and I said when the movies came out, I said, well, that's disappointing to me personally that it changed. But I liked the Mantis in the movies. I liked the movies. So, and I understand that it's a different medium, it's a different era, different people doing it. But it's, in general, I see the movies when they make changes and so forth, and I go with that. I mean, the last thing they want, and the last thing I'd want to do, is be looking over their shoulder going, well, I wouldn't do it that way, I mean, they should have their chance to be creative, and James Gunn made 3 great movies, and they sold, and they were in on time, so that's all good. But it is interesting to see the changes that they have to make. Another thing about, I did a little bit of television work along the way, and I wrote a scene for a television show in which our heroes came out of a building and there was a crowd of people outside. And the showrunner of the TV show pulled me aside and he said, look, this is television. We have to pay everybody who's on screen. There are 2 people outside, We're not doing a crowd. And so there are all sorts of parameters involved in movies that comics were not worried about. If I tell the artist, draw a bunch of people out there, then that's what's going to happen. think that's it.
I think that
Did I
that's it,
cover
yeah.
everything? I don't know.
De repente, lo que decíamos, Mantis se va de los Vengadores, tienes que hacer una nueva formación del equipo. Me gustaría saber hasta qué punto fueron todos elección tuya, supongo que así lo fue. Yo te decir, por ejemplo, de los que cogiste, cuando cogiste el personaje de la bestia, me parecía mucho más interesante la versión de los Vengadores que la versión de la Patrulla X. Y en ese sentido tú siempre tuviste mucho instinto, porque en la época, incluso cuando los X-Men no tenían colección propia o la colección propia era un fracaso, tú los solías utilizar y darles un escaparate y tratarlos con bastante cariño y considero que con bastante acierto. Cuéntanos un poquito cómo rehaces tus Vengadores después de la marcha de Mantis.
So tell us about how you reshaped this Avengers team, and also how you picked from the X-Men this character to do it. It was all your decision, or it was more people involved?
No, it was my decision. Well, the Beast, I'll back up and start with the Beast. He was my first superhero. When you started writing at Marvel, they still published romance comics, Western comics, monster comics. And so young writers wrote those stories while they evaluated, can he actually tell stories? Are they interesting? Before they would let you get near the superheroes. And the first one they let me get near was the Beast. The X-Men, as a comic, had failed. Toward the end, it had fabulous art. Roy Thomas was writing it. It was a great comic, but in America, the Avengers and the X-Men debuted the same month, and they were bi-monthly books. And pretty soon, the Avengers became a monthly book, but the X-Men didn't. The X-Men kind of hung around for a while before it got to be monthly. And I think it was just always imprinted in the readers' heads that the X-Men was a secondary book of some sort. And so that original run came to an end. And when I came into comics to do the Beast, they had thought, well, they were doing well with a werewolf book. And they thought if we make the Beast look more like a werewolf, then maybe that would sell comics. So that's what I was handed. I mean, I didn't make that decision. I was given that book, starting with the second issue of the run. And again, it was still I mean, they trusted me to write that book, and at the same time, it was still auditioning for bigger things. As it happened, I couldn't sell the book either, but they liked, I guess, what I was writing, so I did go on to other things. But again, I like all my characters. That's one thing that I do. If I'm going to do the character, I try to figure out exactly who that character is, and then go with that. And so it was frustrating to me that I had, really gotten involved with the Beast, and then the book came to an end. So I finished up a story in the Hulk that I was writing and all that. But what I was going to say was the X-Men, when you write the Fantastic Four, you're in charge of not only the Fantastic Four, but also Doctor Doom and Galactus and the Silver Surfer and all that sort of stuff. If somebody wants to use one of those characters, they'll come to you and say, can I do this? And you would work it out. It was all very collegial, but that's how it was done. Well, there was nobody who was in charge of the X-Men because they weren't being published. And so I, by sort of default, inherited the X-Men, and I started using them a lot. I never wrote a book called The X-Men, but I like to say that I was the X-Men writer, in that period. But in any event, the Beast came to an end, and Mantis came to an end. I said before, she was going to be a femme fatale, and instead she started charting her own story, and 17 issues later, she was the Celestial Madonna, which, who knew, right? I didn't know we were going to go there, but that's where it went. But that story did come to an end, and it was time to, the Avengers like to reformulate themselves every once in a while, have different people. And the Beast, there still was no X-Men book. This was before the new X-Men. So I said, well, I'm putting the Beast in there. And it was entirely up to me as to what group of people I would put together. But in doing team books, I really, again, I can only say I really like every character. And so one thing I tried to do was never have just lesser characters standing in the background all the time. I mean, I would focus on each one as we went and try to give each one of them, you know, some space. I'm reminded when I took over the Avengers, I was told that the Scarlet Witch always did a hex and then fell down exhausted. And I thought, well, you know, that seems like not enough for somebody who's an Avenger. And so I made her stronger. You know, I made her go from there. So putting together that team, one thing I think about is like, who are these personalities? How will they interact with each other? How will that play out? And, you know, I put together the team that seemed like useful. Just because Mantis has come up a lot, I will add that again, as you said, I've done it in many different ways. The two things that I should mention from what you said is, when I left Marvel and went to work for DC doing Batman and Justice League, somebody at a convention said, does that mean we'll never see Mantis again? Which immediately made me think, how can I get Mantis into DC? And so I came up with a character who, you know, doesn't quite look like her, but talks like her, and doesn't quite explain how she got there, but, you know, so on and so forth. But the biggest thing was, years later, Avengers Celestial Quest had Mantis in it, and the reason for that was I'd come back to Marvel briefly at that point, and the editor said, people have really screwed her up. People have really gone off and done things that didn't work with her, so what we want you to do is like re-establish her. And that's what that series was, and that was 30 years after I had started, done with a magnificent Spanish artist.
Que tenemos aquí, además, Jorge
Sí.
Santamaría.
But it's, you know, it's again, I talked about how people do their own thing after you stop doing it. Jump sideways. One of the other things I did in that time was a Hellcat miniseries. I had created Hellcat back once upon a time, and she was this nice girl who really wanted to be a superhero and was given enough powers that she could make that happen. But her personality was that she was this nice person. And when I came back to Marvel at that time, the editor said, I'd like you to do a Hellcat miniseries. And I said, well, gee, I don't know what's been happening with her. I haven't been reading the books. I don't know what happened. And he said, well, she married the son of Satan, committed suicide, and went to hell. Now you write that. So, you know, as a professional, that's what you write. But it was a, you know, I was surprised that she had taken that route at that point. But again, that's, you know, that's part of being a professional, that it's all, you know, I have a good time working with these characters and doing with them what I want to do and so on and so forth. But in the end, I don't own them, and other people have their shot at them. There was, with comics, again, you don't own them. And what a cycle that I saw with many of us was, in the beginning, you're so happy to be doing Marvel Comics that you're creating things. You know, I'm going to add this, and I'm going to add this. And after a while, you go, wait a minute. I don't own this. I'm not going to get anything out of it. And so I'll stop creating things. I'll just use the characters that already exist. Fortunately, in that period while I was still creating things, I did create Mantis and Star-Lord and Shang-Chi, Guy Gardner across town for DC Comics. And so now that they're making movies out of it, my name goes on screen because, you know, because I created that, and there's some royalties coming in for that sort of thing. So, you know, if I'd created more things, I would be getting more from these movies. And if I hadn't created anything, I would be getting nothing. So it's the idea that it's all work for hire still is unsettling, and yet, you know, that's the deal I signed on to, and that's, you know, and I did put myself into it as much as I could. That's a lot of different things, but hopefully it all connects.
Antes comentamos la diferencia entre que te encarguen una serie sin altas expectativas o que te encarguen una serie que está siendo muy exitosa. Así me gustaría también desde un punto de vista narrativo como guionista, ¿qué te resulta más estimulante? Cuando puedes hacer tú, como nos has contado ahora, la alineación de tu grupo de Vengadores, o cuando te dan una serie como los nuevos Vengadores, los Vengadores Costa Oeste, que en realidad es parte de una serie limitada que editó Greenwald, que escribió Stern y que ya te dicen los personajes son estos. ¿Te gusta más el reto de a ver qué saco de esto que me han dado o de poder crear tú todos los ingredientes desde el principio?
Yeah, and also there is another challenge, which is creating everything from scratch. So, of all the possibilities that you have there as a writer, which is creating things from scratch, or trying to resurrect something that is down, or trying to be as good as something that is good, what is the challenge of those three paths that you like the most, or is not one or the other? It depends on the moment of your career.
Yes. Well, again, you come into comics knowing, I mean, when they say write Captain America, I didn't create Captain America. I can reformulate Captain America. And if I did take over a character that I didn't really like what was happening with them, there are some people who've done comics who just go, I'm here this month, it's all changed, right? I preferred to say, okay, he's here, I want him to be here, there's a story to be had about how you can get from here to there. So, again, there's some parts that are just naive about it, but I mean, I really liked comics, I liked writing the characters in the comics, and so any character that I got, I tried to do the best I could with. So it didn't really matter whether I created it, inherited it. You know, I talked earlier about taking over the Avengers, in that in the end, I wanted to do the best I could. Because as a reader, as somebody who had read the comics, I appreciated it when they were like good stories or good, you know, good art or whatever. And that's what I wanted to give back. You know, I wanted to do that. And within that, there's the business decisions of, did I create this? Do I get paid for this? You know, that kind of thing. What I mentioned earlier was the great thing was I wasn't being told do this or don't do that. So I was able to kind of follow my own star instinct, you know, as to where to go. But it didn't really matter to me how the character got to me. It's just if the character got to me, then that's the character that I want to do. And really, I mean, you know, that's the answer to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. A lo largo de la larga ya historia de los cómics Marvel, puedes coger números que significan muchas cosas por razones muy diferentes. Una de ellas por los mensajes que mandan, ¿no? Generalmente se pone mucho de ejemplo pues el juicio a chaqueta amarilla, donde el mensaje está claro. Ni siquiera Bueno, por si hay alguien que no haya leído, pues el personaje pues golpea a su pareja y los Vengadores deciden, obviamente, que ni siquiera siendo uno de los héroes más poderosos de la Tierra se pueden tolerar cierto tipo de actitudes, ¿no? Lo cual es guay. Y de eso tú lo vas leyendo y te permea. Pero hay otros números que también tienen mensajes muy importantes que me parecen muy significativos y que igual yo creo que no tuvieron tanto foco encima. Y esto le sucede a Steve Englehart con un número concreto, no recuerdo el cual era la numeración española, seguro que alguno de vosotros sí, que es el número en el que Pájaro Burlón, un spoiler, pero bueno, tiene que decidir si mata o no mata al jinete fantasma después de lo que le hizo a ella, y toma la decisión que alguien entrenado por Shield pues tomaría. Pero claro, su pareja a lo mejor pues no le parece bien, y esto lleva a dilemas éticos de cuál es la línea roja que uno puede aceptar o no puede aceptar para ser un héroe o no ser un héroe, ¿no? Y me parece que este número contaba muy bien todo esto y cómo las decisiones también te pueden afectar en el terreno personal, ¿no? Con la gente que te rodea. Me gustaría que nos hablaras de este número, el número en el que pones ante el abismo, por así decirlo, aunque el que estaba en el abismo era el jinete fantasma, pero bueno, en el que pones en el abismo a Pájaro Burlón, y que nos hablaras un poco de este episodio.
Yeah, so Hawkeye and Mockingbird were married, and I inherited them and in the books. But she had been an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. The rest of them had sort of come into the Avengers for whatever reason. But she'd been an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it seemed to me that S.H.I.E.L.D. agents probably killed people now and again from what we knew about S.H.I.E.L.D. And so by just letting the characters run for me, I ended up where Mockingbird had been basically raped, drugged and raped by the Phantom Ghost Rider, whatever he was called at the time. They kept changing his name. Again, American comics, so we didn't specify exactly what happened to her, but it was, but it was clear. And she then killed the Ghost Phantom Rider. That seemed like what her character would do. That seemed right to me. And that led, once that sequence was over with, her husband, who was a tried and true Avenger who believed that Avengers never killed anybody, and she, who was like perfectly comfortable with having killed somebody, the two of them went at it. And this was right at the end of my run. What I was going to do was sort of have all the Avengers sort of choose up sides. Were they on her side or were they on his side? And it was going to be basically what became the Civil War later in Marvel continuity. Both the East Coast Avengers and the West Coast Avengers would split and reformulate into these two teams. And then the series, my time at Marvel came to an end, and so I didn't get to develop that. But it was one of those things, again, we started out, I'm a conscientious objector, but I could totally see why Mockingbird would kill this guy, and that's what I went with. What else was in there?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. But again, it's doing the characters. It's doing the characters as you see them, and it. That's it. Yeah.
No para que nos hable de ello, pero otra anécdota es que yo creo que una de las sagas de viajes en el tiempo con acciones en más momentos distintos los escribió en su época de los Nuevos Vengadores. No sé cómo se llamaba aquí, era Lost in Time o en Time Space, que tenías personajes en 7 líneas temporales diferentes. Esto ya es como, no vamos a hacer pelotas malabares con 3 o con 4, vamos a echar aquí pelotas y tal. Eso fue un experimento, me imagino, narrativo particularmente complicado.
You know, the experimentation, the narrative storytelling of having 7 timelines at the same time, it was a crazy thing to do, or it was natural for you?
It was natural for me. I like complexity too. I liked building stories as big as I could make them. And in the regular Avengers, several years before, I had done a time travel story with Kang and Immortus and so forth. And somebody said at the time, no one has ever done a successful time travel story. They always forget something that could have, and I said, I'm gonna write one, I'm gonna, And so the first one went well, and so this later one, I wanted to try it again, and the idea of having people in 7 different time eras, and how would what something happened here affect what happened here, would affect what happened here, how would that all come together? I mean, it's one thing to say, I want things to be as complex as possible, but at the end of the day, it's all got to come back and make sense. So I did that a number of times. At the end of The Silver Surfer, I did this whole Kree-Skrull war thing that got as complex as I could make it and then pulled it back together. So I like challenges as a writer. I like saying that's never been done. A, can I do it? And B, how would I do it? How would that work? And figuring that out is interesting to me. I have my college degree in psychology, and the reason I went down that road was I wanted to know why people are the way they are. And by the time I got my degree, I said, psychology is not going to answer that question. Psychology has 30 different theories about how that works, and every one of them works if that's the way you formulate everything. But I wanted the one answer. Well, I never really got the one answer, but by doing all these different characters, I could see how this character why this character did this, why this character did this. And so I went from trying to find one answer to the idea that I'm now sort of in charge of 200 answers, in a sense, And I want all of them to work. And so that bred complexity, that bred just trying to do the biggest thing that I could do. And again, all I needed to do was tell the artist, here's what happens. And we were good. I didn't have to worry about the budget or the all the different things that other media require. So there was nothing. I was very lucky, I often think, because I was given complete creative freedom. They said, yeah, you can do anything you want to do if it sells and it comes in on time. But that wouldn't have worked if I'd been stuck with artists who couldn't draw horses or, didn't understand what space looked like or that kind of thing. And I was fortunate to get, most people who do comics are professionals and they can do most things, but there are artists who can't draw horses, right? Horses are weird looking and they don't do that. I had artists who could draw anything. And so, I could say anything. And I'd get art back, and it would be that's what I would have. So I'm aware that it's one thing to say, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want to do, but it's a hybrid medium. Unless I'm a writer-artist, unless I'm one of those people who does it all myself, I got to hand it off to somebody else and hope that he understands what the heck is going on here. And there have been occasions over the years when people didn't. in that time travel story, in the original Avengers that I mentioned, everything leading up to it had been done by one artist, and then the big climactic double-sized issue was handed off to a guy who hadn't been involved in it at all. And so he made some mistakes in there, which had to be corrected because he didn't really know all the parameters of it. But by and large, most people, and I mean, he was a special case because he was a good artist, but he just was thrown into the middle of this big complex thing. What attracted me to comics in the first place was the art. I read comics in the 50s, and American comics in the 50s were Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, maybe a little Martian Manhunter, a little Aquaman off to the side. Stories weren't that memorable, but a lot of the art was. And I'm a big fan of Dick Sprang, if anybody knows Dick Sprang. He drew Batman, and his stuff was all extreme angles and, and giant typewriters, and it was a very weird world that Dick Sprang illustrated in Batman. So I resonated first of all to the art, and I sort of fell into writing. It wasn't what I was shooting for, but one day they asked me to write something, and I wrote it, and I said, oh, well, I like doing this, and they liked what I wrote, and everything came from that. But I've always really loved comic book art, and so the great thing then was that I worked with all these different artists, and every story I would get back and see my ideas turned into stuff on the page, which was always exciting to me. Because of the fact that you're dependent on everybody in the process, the letterer too, the colorist too. I mean, any of those people can screw up what you had in mind, so you better hope that most of them know what they're doing and will do it to the best of their ability.
Nos vamos a dejar evidentemente muchas cosas fuera, ya lo sabíamos antes de empezar por tu amplísima trayectoria, pero no queremos dejarnos fuera tu trabajo en Batman, que no fue grande en tanto a números, pero sí en calidad y reconocimiento, considerado por muchos como una de las etapas más redondas que condensan todo lo que debe ser el personaje, ¿no? Pero precisamente por eso, por conocerlo también, me gustaría que nos contaras. A ti en realidad lo que te dijeron es que hicieras lo que hiciste en Los Vengadores, en la Liga de la Justicia, y les arreglaras un poco los personajes y la colección, pero tú pediste específicamente hacer Batman. Batman es un personaje que fascina a todos los creadores, incluso los que no leen superhéroes, autores europeos que dicen a mí no me interesa estar en esa industria, pero mira, de Batman sí que haría una historia. Me gustaría que nos contaras por qué crees de esa fascinación tan transversal, tan universal, de Batman como personaje para fascinar a gente de inquietudes creativas tan diferentes.
Well, there's a number of things about Batman. One, he could be done in black and white. Superman needs blue and red and yellow. All these people, all these other characters need colors as part of what they are. But Batman is just so down to the bone, you can do him in black and white. Secondly, when they first created Batman, they created this kind of weird world with the Joker, who in the original Joker was a homicidal maniac. And every Joker story ended with him dying or going to jail. And then every Joker story started with him not quite dying or escaping jail. It was like the first serialized thing way back in the beginning of comics. And after 2 years, Batman was such a hit that DC wanted to do more Batman stuff. And at that point, they introduced Robin, the Boy Wonder, and they made it more family friendly. And the Joker stopped being as terrifying as he had been. And so for 30 years after that, he lived in the hacienda. And, you know, I mean, it was like he did jokey things, but he wasn't scary at all. But as I say, I was really struck by Dick Sprang's Batman, which was weird and eccentric and had stuff going on. And as was said, I was asked to come over to DC and fix the Justice League. And I said, yeah, I'll do that, but I want to do Batman because he was the one of the, when I mentioned Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, Martian Manhunter, and Aquaman, Batman to me was always the most interesting of those guys. And he's interesting because he lives in this really dark world with weird people in it. And he's also, the only powers he has are his own. I mean, Daredevil's kind of the same. There are other people who do that now. But he was the one who wasn't from another planet, who wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider, or wasn't, you know, broke a beaker in the laboratory and inhaled the fumes, whatever. He is just as good as he can make himself as a human being. And that was interesting to me, you know, the fact that he is as good as he can possibly get. And in my understanding of him, if he pushed it any farther, he'd go over the edge. People like to say from time to time, oh, he's crazy. Batman is crazy. I don't think Batman is crazy. I think he's extremely structured, extremely solid, and he knows that he can't go beyond this point, but he is as far out as he can go, which that's an interesting character to write. So I thought that was my one chance to do Batman. I'd been a Marvel writer to that point. Here I was, and again, without getting too inside baseball, as they say, but when I quit Marvel, at that point, my wife had traveled in Europe for a year by herself before she knew me. And I thought, I want to go to Europe. I like, you know, I'd never been to Europe. I'd like to go to Europe. And so we started making arrangements, and then DC called me up and said, come do this. And I said, well, I can do it, but only for a limited amount of time because I'm already planning for when I'm going to leave. And that's why my runs on that were fairly short. But at the same time, it meant that, all right, everything that I want to do in Batman, I got to do it in 7 issues. It turned out to be 8 because the early one sold and they added another one. But it's like, I need to tell a complete story. I need to come in, I need to do it, and I need to get out. And I know just exactly how much longer. This is not going to be one of those Mantis things where it just kind of like goes on until I get to the end somewhere. It's like, no, it's got to be there. So it's like the concentrated essence of what I thought Batman should be. And what did I think he should be? I wanted to bring back the pulp darkness, if that's a reference that makes sense, from the 40s. You know, when the Joker was a homicidal maniac and things were dark. The ink in those early issues, there's more ink on those pages than an entire comic book these days. I mean, it was just like really dark and weird and all that. Wanted to bring that back, but I also wanted to know more about Bruce Wayne. I wanted to know about the guy who's inside the costume. And so to do that, I came up with Silver St. Cloud, who was a strong businesswoman. Got to be strong if you want to hang out with Bruce Wayne, right? Even if you don't know what else he does. He's a high-powered executive who does many things. And so on the one hand, I brought back stuff that had been lost from the 40s, but also took it forward in the 70s. And once again, so I wrote all those scripts. I had a time limit because I was leaving the country. So I wrote these things script in advance, handed them in, and left. And I fully expected to get a couple of second-rate artists because that's what DC mostly had in those days. The people who were big stars at DC had all gone to Marvel. So I made it as bulletproof as I could. I tried to make it the essence of Batman so that if I get a really bad artist, it'll still, kind of get there. Then I went to Europe, and it was 6 months later when we went to Europe, spent a month in Scotland, a month in England, a month in France, a month in Germany, a month in Scandinavia, came to Spain just long enough to get on a boat and go to Mallorca, where we spent the winter. And so we were living in a little village in the mountains of Mallorca, and I got this package from America, and it had all the finished comics in it. And that's the first time that I saw who drew it. They were great, I honestly, I'm not particularly religious, but I honestly said, thank you, God. When I saw that the artists had put as much into it as I had put into it. It wasn't until then I came back from Europe and I got to meet Marshall Rogers and Terry Austin for the first time. So that's a case where things really, everybody, and they loved Batman too. I mean, you can tell. So everybody involved in that project really wanted to do the best Batman they could do. And once again, I did that. It ended up with The Laughing Fish, which is now a famous story, right? At the time, it's just, this seems like the thing to do. But it really resonated with a lot of people. And again, it's very odd that stuff that I did on the fly in the moment 50 years ago has become a touchstone in Batman. And same with some other things that I've done. It's very weird to become part of history, because history implies a lot more than what we were thinking about when we were doing it. But I wanted to do
Queremos
the best Batman I could.
Queremos que le quede tiempo a la gente para la sesión de firmas, así que voy a hacer una última pregunta, pero tiene que ser una respuesta rápida y breve. Decíamos al principio que cuando tú escribes, sobre todo géneros no realistas, mandas muchas advertencias sobre el mundo en el que vives, ¿no? En tu etapa de Batman nos avisabas de lo que podrían ser los peligros de que alguien demente se metiera en política. Y supongo que mandas una advertencia, hay que tener cuidado. Ahora cuando enciendes el telediario y ves las noticias, ¿qué piensas de aquel mensaje que nos mandabas y de cómo ha evolucionado la sociedad?
Being in the world today, what do you think about those warnings of having a madman people doing politics?
In talking about Batman per se, or just anything?
No. Your Batman, having this warning about the danger of having a madman going into politics, and now living in the world that we live.
Right. Well, I remember we were traveling in Scotland in 2015, and everybody would say, "Do you think Donald Trump's going to get elected?" And I said, no. So, my ability to predict politics is different. But, I think that's one of the interesting things to me, to jump back to Captain America. I think what would Captain America, the one who believes in American ideals, what would he be doing during all this time? He'd probably be leading the revolution, right? But I'm not writing Captain America. It's not up to me. And again, when I was given Captain America, it was just me. Now, if you wanted to do something radical with Captain America, you'd have to get Disney to sign off on it, merchandising to sign off on it, all these different things that it's now a franchise. It's now far more than just a simple character. So I bemoan the fact that nothing in the comics is really like dealing with what's actually going on in America. On the other hand, I understand probably can't get there from here right now. So, is that the answer to the question? Or?
Bueno, quería deciros, bueno, somos conscientes de lo afortunados que hemos sido teniendo este ratito, de que mañana vamos a continuar charlando con él. Sabemos que se van a quedar muchas cosas fuera. Ha sido un autor que ha peleado porque los personajes de sus cómics, aunque fueran para un público mayormente juvenil, también pudieran interesar al público adulto. Se ha preocupado porque tuvieran vida sexual, aunque no se pudiera mostrar, y esto también es como me salto un poco las normas pues, para poder conseguir lo que quiero. Ha hecho otros grandes personajes, no hemos hablado de Star-Lord, no hemos hablado de Sanchi, se quedan muchas cosas fuera, pero para cerrar la charla y pasar las firmas, yo quería aprovechar, ya que no hablamos mucho de Batman, una frase que dice uno de sus personajes, Hugo Strange, que hay un momento en el que le dice al lector, dice, el camino de un personaje genial o de un genio, de un sabio, es un camino solitario. Y yo me alegro mucho de que él, que ha sido muy visionario, aquí se equivocara, porque hemos tenido la suerte de estar con un genio. Su vida no es nada solitaria porque ha dejado una huella en todos nosotros y vaya por donde vaya, su trabajo hace que le recordemos con cariño, que le queramos y como, aparte de leyendo su obra, un público despide a alguien a quien quiere. Con un fuerte aplauso.